Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're moving on to Unit 4.2, which looks at evolution and natural selection. So this is part one notes, and that's looking at an introduction to evolution, what it is, some of the key names in it, and how that led us to the theory of evolution. So if you're ready, let's get set, let's get awesome, and let's get learning. Woo! All right, so 4.2, Part 1, the introduction to evolution. So what is evolution? Simply put, it is change over time. Now, if you want to look at that in terms of a more scientific definition, it is a process by which modern organisms have descended from ancient organisms. So what this is saying is that through millions and millions and millions of years of life, things changed over time, leading to new species. And as the environment kept changing, that kept leading to more and more mutations and better adaptations that allowed organisms to survive, pass those on. And over millions of years of these small changes, these small mutations, they've accumulated into the organisms that we see today. Kind of like this picture from The Simpsons. I really like this one. Is Homer sapien. So we start off with the very ancient ancestor, the monkey, or a particular type of monkey, and then you end up with the Homo sapien. Now we call this the theory of evolution, and that's actually a very important term, because how science uses the term theory is actually vastly different from how the rest of society uses the word theory. A lot of times in, just regular speech or on TV or movies, someone will say, oh yeah, I got a theory about that. But what they're saying is, yeah, I have a guess or a hunch or a hypothesis about that. What they're saying is they think they know what is the correct solution, but we're not quite sure. Like someone said, okay, well, how did the fire start? I have a theory about that. That's not how science uses the word theory. In science, theory means something vastly different. It is not a guess or a hunch or a possible answer. That's what a hypothesis is. To us, scientists, a theory is a well-supported and testable explanation of a particular phenomenon. So what that means is, it is the explanation of why something happens. So evolution tells us that there's change over time. The theory of evolution tells us why there is change over time. So what is going on that leads to these different species today? So that's why we call it the process of change. Now notice some of the terms in there. Well-supported, testable. When scientists agree to classify something as a theory, what they mean is they've done extensive research, tests, run simulations, done experiments. They've collected mountains and mountains and mountains of data that support this idea, this explanation. And because of that, it is an explanation, but because it's so heavily supported and there's data and evidence that backs it up, that's when they classify it as a theory. A theory is not something that gets, tossed around willy-nilly. Hey, let's call that the theory of blankets or the theory of blah, blah, blah. No, they only apply the term theory when it's been heavily tested and supported. So lots of experiments, lots of research, lots of data collection. So why is it that people have problems with theories? Well, because theories can't be proven. It's really hard to prove the why of something. Now, that's different than a law, like in science, laws. They are what will happen. Very easy to prove. The law of gravity says if I throw something up in the air, it will fall back down. I can throw stuff up in the air, guess what? It's always going to come back down. But the explanation for why that occurs, that's harder to prove. So there is the law of gravity, but there's also the theory of gravity that explains why is it that throw something up and it comes back down. And it's the same idea with evolution, because it's looking at why a process occurs, why this thing happens. It is very, very, very hard to to prove explanations, but it's still very, very heavily supported, lots of evidence, lots of data collection. Like I said, scientists, they're very particular with how they classify things with laws and theories. When they apply those terms, whether it's the law of such and such or the theory of such and such, when they add those terms, it's not just because, why not? It's because there's been years and years and years of study on the subject, and so much data, it's be easy to get lost in it if you were to look at all of that data today. So it's not like it's just done on a whim, and it's not like it's a guess. It is a very, very heavily documented, supported, experimented, researched idea and explanation. All right, moving on. Darwin, Charles Darwin, my main man in evolution. So Charles Darwin, he was an English scientist that lived in the 1800s, and he's best known for his work involving evolution. Sorry. So we actually attribute the very first idea leading to the theory of evolution, we attribute that to Darwin. Well, the question becomes, how did he do that? Well, he went on a voyage. He was, like we said, he was an English scientist. He was part of a crew on a ship called the HMS Beagle. And what it did was it traveled around and allowed him to do research. They went all over South America. Most people know him for his work in the Galapagos Islands, but he spent a relatively short amount of time there. He spent most of his time around South America looking at some of the larger birds there and all different manner of organisms. He's also collected lots of fossils, evidence, living specimens, dead specimens, lots of observations. And he came back with a lot of stuff from his trips. So he took this voyage, went all the way around South America, traveled inland as well, and then he went to the Galapagos Islands, which is where we tend to focus on his ideas, which we'll get to that in a moment. So Darwin wrote a book, but he didn't write it as soon as he got back to England. After his voyage and he returned back home to England, he did write a book that kind of looked at everything he studied. So he documented all of his observations, his evidence, his ideas, his sketches. He was actually a pretty good artist. And he also incorporated the conclusions that he drew from all of these information, from all this evidence and information and data and everything. But he didn't publish it right away. And a lot of that is because he knew that there would be backlash from it. Even today, and this is the year 2020, there's still backlash with the idea of evolution. Today, it is widely accepted and pretty much the entire scientific community accepts it. But there's a lot of people outside of the scientific community that do not accept it. So he knew that it was going to be controversial when he came up with his ideas. So 25 years pass, and he's just sitting on this handwritten manuscript on this book. And finally, he decided that he should publish it. Now, what finally got him to do it was that another scientist had announced that they just finished a similar study and was going to write a paper on it. And the ideas of this author were very, very similar to the theories of evolution that Darwin was working on. And Darwin, he's like, nuh-uh. I spent a lot of time on this. I did this and came up with this information 25 years ago. Ain't nobody stepping on my discovery. I don't know if that's actually how he thought of it, but he decided, he sat on his book long enough, and since he did do the study first, he should be published first. And so he published his book that was entitled On the Origin of Species. And that book is still in circulation today. I mean, I don't even know which edition they're up to now, but yeah, I mean, they still republish it, and there's still copies of it. It's a pretty impressive book. I haven't read it all the way through, but it is on my list to finish. Now that we're in quarantine, maybe I can finally do that. Darwin speaks. Hold on one moment. Get the volume up. All right, let's hear Mr. Charles Darwin speak to us.
My name is Charles Darwin, and I am a famed scientist who studied tortoises and finches in the Galapagos Islands, as well as other life in South America. I traveled there on the HMS Beagle, and from my observations and studies, I published a book called On the Origin of Species that highlights my ideas on the theory of evolution.
All righty. Yeah, way to go, Darwin. Woo! Speaking from beyond the grave, isn't that awesome? All right. Let's keep going then. Turn the volume back off so there's no backlash in sound. All right. So let's start talking about his journey. So we mentioned that he traveled from England and he went to South America and the Galapagos Islands on a ship called the HMS Beagle. Now, if you're wondering where the Galapagos Islands are, they're due west. So they're a cluster of islands just west of Ecuador. So Ecuador is on the western coast of South America, kind of the northwest coast. And it is, I don't know how many miles, but it's in the ocean off of there. So he went around all of South America, you know your geography, England, crossed the Atlantic, made to South America, kind of did a lot of exploring in there, boat went around, and then here we are on the western coast, and then to the Galapagos. And when he was there, he studied the differences in similar species. So he looked at different kinds of finches and different kinds of tortoises, and he kind of looked at their similarities, yes, but also what made them unique. And specifically, the ones that we like to talk about the most are the Galapagos tortoises and the finches. And those are the ones that are most well known. It's not the only things he studied, but that's what we tend to think of when we talk about his studies. So we're going to show some examples of that and what he discovered. First off, the Galapagos Islands. So here is the overall map of South America in the upper right corner. So we got the Atlantic Ocean on this side, Pacific Ocean on this side. England would be like way up here at the corner of the screen. So you went looky, looky, look, study, 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 up here, and then they made their way to this cluster of islands, which are the Galapagos Islands. Now you might know that there's a lot of mountains and volcanoes because they are volcanic islands, meaning that they arose from undersea volcanoes that erupted, and over time and over many, many eruptions, the lava built up until it made the islands. And then as tectonic plates moved and shifted, kind of separated them and broke them apart. So now we have all these wonderful islands with mountains and volcanoes, and that is where he did a lot of his studies. All right, so we're ready. So the tortoises. So these are some examples of Galapagos Island tortoises. Now, what he noticed is that there were tortoises on pretty much all the islands, but that the tortoises on the different islands looked differently. And if you look at this guy right here, he's got kind of a slightly bumpy shell, kind of a muddy brown color, got a long neck, as opposed to this guy whose shell is much smoother. He's also got a much darker coloration, and he doesn't seem to have the super long neck. This guy, a bit of a bumpy shell, not as long of a neck, and notice that his legs actually are higher up. Plus, he's more gray. So even though they're all tortoises, he did notice some distinct differences in them, whether it was their coloration, their legs, their shells, the length of their necks. And what he concluded is that between this and his work with the finches, a lot of it had to do with the island they were located on. And you can kind of see that here. This darker guy, he was on a very lush island. So lots of greenery, lots of flora, as opposed to this guy, and even this guy too. They came from more rocky or sandy islands. So it was Darwin's conclusion that maybe, possibly, this could be because they've adapted to their surroundings. So those that could kind of blend in a little bit more were more successful and survived. And here are some of his sketches about the finches. Again, there were finches on all of the islands. However, he noticed some very, very distinct differences, particularly in their beaks. And so you might notice that this type of finch lived on one island, this one lived on another, this one lived on another, and this one lived on a separate island. And again, he studied them, he learned their habits, and especially he focused on their diet, because he noticed that on an island that had a lot of harder nuts like acorns or other things like that, a lot of hard tree nuts, it's when you tend to see the finches with the larger beaks. But if they were more small insects that like termites or ants that was the primary food source, you saw the smaller beaks. For the ones that had the fruit, that they had to dig the pits or portions out of, you saw maybe the medium-sized beaks. Or if they ate smaller seeds, maybe this kind of beak here, still a little thicker, so it can kind of crunch it up, but it doesn't need to be that big if it's only eating a smaller seed. So that was his conclusion about this, or his observation, that he noticed these birds come from different islands, and it appeared as if their beaks were tailored to their particular diet. And that led to the conclusion that, once again, over time, there were adaptations or mutations that occurred, and those with the better mutations, the better adaptations, were the ones that survived longer and led to the version of the finches that he saw on each island. All right, speaking about his observations, let's take a look, shall we? So based on his data, we can take Darwin's ideas and we can sum them up in 5 key observations. And it was these 5 key observations that he used to come up with his theory of evolution. And that's the theory of evolution that we very much use today. It's been tweaked a little bit here or there, but the core of it is still the same. And again, it's all based on these 5 observations. Now, these are not specific observations. Again, we're taking all of his data and kind of condensing it down to these 5 key points. So let's take a look at them, shall we? So observation 1, there is a constant struggle for existence in the natural world. In previous chapters, we've talked about competition, how organisms have to compete in order to survive. Now, when we talk about competition in humans, we usually think about sports, and one team is going to win, one team is going to lose. pretty much the same idea, except instead of a trophy, you get to live if you are the successful competitor. So animals and actually even plants, but he focused on the animal aspects in his studies. So they compete for resources, and resources are anything that an organism needs to survive. So whether it's different birds competing for the same food or competition for life, such as, are you fast enough to escape the predator, or are you going to be on the menu tonight? They need territory to live and find food and raise their young. You can also tell with I don't think they're gazelle, but they're related to the gazelle here. They're competing for the right to reproduce. So which one is going to be able to reproduce that year and which one isn't? So there's constant struggle for existence. In other words, competition. Organisms have to compete for food, for water, for space, for mates, for any resource. You can even have two bunnies that are competing for, not being the fox's dinner. So there's lots and lots of competition going on. And whichever one competes the most successfully is the one that's going to live longer. You live longer, you can have more offspring, and then those offspring will have the same traits that allowed you to live longer as well. Observation 2. An individual's fitness describes how well it is prepared to survive and reproduce in its particular environment. That's a key point. Both of these organisms that I've pictured here are very, very successful. So they are both very successful in their environments. They both have high fitness in their environments. Here we have the great white shark. All of its adaptations, everything that allows it to survive, is what makes it such a successful organism. It has extremely high fitness in the ocean. However, if I take the great white shark out of the ocean and put it in the savanna, its fitness drops to 0. It cannot survive in the savanna because its adaptations, what allows it to survive and reproduce, are not helpful there. On the same token, the giraffe is very successful. It has very high fitness in the savanna. It's able to cool itself off. It has long neck and long tongue to reach food sources that others can't. They're pretty fast and pretty strong. Very successful organisms in the savanna. Very, very high fitness. But if I take that giraffe and put it in the middle of the ocean, its fitness drops to 0. Because the adaptations that made it so successful in the savanna are not meant to help it survive in this new watery ocean environment. So when we talk about fitness, we're talking about how well something is able to survive and reproduce in its environment, because it has to be tailored to where it lives. That's how things change over time, because those are the ones that survive longest in their environment are the ones that have more offspring that also have their traits. Now notice it also says reproduce. You can have the best traits in the world, but if you do not successfully reproduce and have offspring that can then pass on those traits, it doesn't matter because the traits are going to die with you. So we're looking at organisms with the best adaptations that are able to survive and reproduce in their environment. That's what we look at when we talk about an organism's fitness. Option 3, fitness is determined by adaptations. These are inherited traits that increase an organism's chances of survival. So here we have the shark again. The adaptations that make it such a great organism, such a highly successful, high fitness organism in the ocean, is the fact that it's very streamlined, so it has less drag. It's able to breathe oxygen from the water through its gills. It has very sharp teeth, and it has continuously growing rows of teeth, so even if it loses some, it just replaces them. They're very powerful, very, very strong muscles, so they can swim very quickly and charge their prey. They also have a sixth sense, kind of like a electric sense, where they can detect the electrical biorhythms of organisms. So it helps them when they're hunting. So those are all wonderful traits that they inherited from their parents, who inherited them from their parents, that allow them to be so successful today. In fact, in the last, 100+ million years, sharks have not changed that much, specifically the great white shark. The only difference between the great white shark of today and its ancient ancestor, the Megalodon carcharodon or Carcharodon megalodon, I forgot which one goes first, is size. They've gotten smaller. Why they get smaller? Likely because their prey organisms, the larger ones died off and there was only smaller prey. So those that were smaller sharks could more easily eat enough to survive, as opposed to larger sharks, which would die from starvation. All right, and then we got the giraffe again. What makes the giraffe so successful? What adaptations allows it to survive and reproduce? Well, we kind of started talking about that already. Its long neck will allow it to reach higher sources of food that other animals like zebras or gazelles or wildebeests can't reach, so it's less competition for food. They also have very, very long tongues, which help because sometimes there are thorns on those trees and on the higher branches, but the long tongues are able to kind of get in between the thorns so they can help them safely get food. And when I was at a workshop at a zoo, something they told us is at one point, they've done infrared imaging of giraffes. And what they noticed is that those white lines that kind of outline their spots, or not white, but the paler lines, that's actually where their blood vessels are located, like the bigger blood vessels. So what they believe it is a way to cool them off. The darker spots, because of the darker coloration, would actually absorb more heat. But with the blood vessels being underneath the paler portions of their skin and fur, it's able to give off the heat. So it cools down the blood releases it to the environment, and then the organism, in this case the giraffe itself, is cooler in such a hot environment. Their long, slender legs also do provide them pretty fast running, and also don't ever get kicked by one. They got pretty mean kicks, so they also have some strength in there as well. These are traits that allow them to be so successful, that allows them to survive in the savannah and reproduce and have offspring that have these traits as well. It's cool. All right, observation 4. One of the most misinterpreted things of evolution: survival of the fittest. Now, a lot of times people think that means, survival of the strongest. That is so not what it means. Remember, we said fitness is looking at an organism's ability to survive and reproduce, so survive and thrive in their environment. So survival of the fittest means that the organism with the best adaptations suited to their environment, in other words, the organism with the highest fitness, will survive and pass those traits on to their offspring. So if you have traits that allow you to live longer, you will not just live longer, but it also allows you the opportunity to have more offspring. Those offspring will be born with the same traits as you. They will live longer, so they will have lots of offspring because their traits help them to survive just like they help you. As a result, over time and over many, many generations, you start seeing that maybe the entire population, the entire species has this particular set of traits because it was so successful. It helped one organism survive longer, had multiple babies. Those babies all survived longer, had many babies, and so on, so on. So survival of the fittest looks at how the organism with the best adaptations survive. Now, what we also call this, Darwin's term was survival of the fittest, but now we call it natural selection. So essentially, nature is selecting for the best adaptations, the best chances of survival. Over long periods of time, natural selection will gradually result in changes in the inherited characteristics of an entire species. We said maybe at some point there were squirrels with longer tails, even longer tails than there are now. And then there was one that was born with a mutation. That mutation shortened the tail just a little bit. Well, without having just slightly shorter tail, it wasn't as long, so it wasn't as easy for hawks or other predators to grab it. As a result, more of those squirrels survived, or that squirrel survived longer, and it had lots and lots of squirrel babies. All the squirrel babies had the slightly shorter tail too. So they survive longer, have lots of babies with the slightly shorter tail, and over many, many generations, soon you don't see the squirrels with the really, really long tail anymore. You see the squirrels with the slightly shorter long tail. Ooh, sorry. Hi. Competition. And it's kind of the same way. Here we have the not quite gazelles, like the gazelle cousins. Was it addax? Sorry, I'm trying to remember my zoo knowledge. But let's say you have these two males going at it because they're trying to fight for the right to survive or to reproduce in this case. One of them is pretty big. The other one is smaller. Now, maybe the fact that this one's smaller makes it more agile. So then it's easier to dodge, and the bigger one actually gets tired out quickly because it's got a lot more bulk and mass. So since he gets tired out and the smaller one is very agile, he'll be the one that survives. Or not survives. I don't think they fight to death, but he'll be the winner, which means he will gain the right to reproduce, and his offspring will then be slightly smaller and more agile, just like he is, and they'll be passed on and on and on. Same with the idea of finches. So when the islands kind of broke apart, there's likely an ancestral finch species that was on the islands already. But then over time, as they broke apart and there were slight differences in the ecosystems on each of the islands, then we saw different food sources available. So if there were more so larger seeds or nuts that were available, then finches had a naturally larger beak survived longer because they had an easier time of cracking open the seeds or the nuts to get the food. So they survived longer. They had more babies than the ones with shorter beaks. As a result, the population would start switching, and you'd see more and more each generation with the larger beaks. And then over time, that would become the standard, the norm of the finches on that island. And you can make the same claim for any one of these. If you look at the one that eats scrubs, it's smaller, but it's not like super thin. So it allows it to, and it's got that little overhang, so it allows it to kind of dig into the ground a bit, find the grubs and pull them out, or go a little bit into trees, into the bark, grab the grub and pull it out. Something with a much thinner beak, like the one on the bottom left for flying insects, wouldn't be able to get into the bark of a tree as easily or dig into the ground a little bit as easily. But this guy here on the bottom right who eats grubs, that overhang of his top beak would be really good for that. So again, competition. They're competing for food sources. And observation number 5. all species that are alive today have descended from ancestral species with modifications. So that idea of modifications is what we've been talking about, that there are slight changes to traits within the population, and whichever version of those traits helps an organism to better survive, those are the ones that are passed on. Now, before someone starts saying, Ms. Komar, aren't they all the same? No, look at humans. Are we all the same? Do we have the exact same traits? No, we got some people with great eyesight, some people with not so great eyesight. We have some people that maybe have larger bone structures and some people who are naturally very slender. Now, natural selection doesn't exactly work for humans anymore because our technology kind of takes us out of the equation. We no longer rely purely on nature. But at least leading up to this point, our big adaptation has been this thing right here, our brains. We were able to problem solve, think outside of just the present, we're able to build structures and tools, and that allowed us to create technology, learn more about how things work, create even more technology. If we lived in a purely wild and natural selection based system, like other organisms, most of us wouldn't be here. I can't really see all that well without these. So I'd easily be prey for a predator. I might have a harder time finding food. That's why you don't necessarily see a lot of other animals with detrimental traits. You don't see nearsighted lions all that often because they wouldn't survive long enough. They, again, wouldn't be able to get food or wouldn't see a hyena coming up and they would die. So this idea that we all come from a common ancestor is actually not that hard to imagine. In one of our, I believe our next PowerPoint or our next notes, we're actually going to talk about the evidence for evolution, and we'll even look at some of the similarities between organisms of today as well as organisms today with organisms of the past. So the diverse species that we see today have actually evolved from common ancestors. And for instance, let's say all birds came from a common ancestor. Now, there are many different species of birds. You have little tiny hummingbirds, you have big giant eagles, but we still see a lot of similarities that suggest that they are still related to each other. And if you go back far enough in evolutionary history, you'll be able to see the common ancestor that predates all of them. And that's what we're talking about with this. And we call this a tree of life. I'm going to show you an example. Now, this is just one very highly simplified variation. They've actually just recently redone the tree of life. This one is many times old, but it shows at some point there is one common ancestor to all life on Earth. And then it broke into, or we had a division and two groups arose. We have the true bacteria or the eubacteria, and then this line, which led to another split, which we have the archaebacteria, and now remember, bacteria are prokaryotes. So then this would be the split between the prokaryotes and the eukaryotic organisms. And then every time it splits, that means that there's a common ancestor. So there's a common ancestor here too that leads to this way towards animals, fungi, sponges, cnidarians, and this way to plants. And then you have the breaking of the plants and how they split off at different times. Here, let's go back this way, common ancestor between fungi and animals. Actually isn't that hard to imagine. They may look more like plants, but they do not photosynthesize. They break down and absorb nutrients from organisms. They just don't have mouths to do it, but they still do it. Kind of like how we digest and break things down internally to get nutrients. the animals, then we can see how they change. We have simplified sponges and cnidarians. Cnidarians are jellyfish. Then we have the flatworms, also known as platyhelminthes. We have the rotifers, the roundworms, which are the nematodes. We have lophophoridates. Let's see, arthropods, which include chelicerates like spiders and horseshoe crabs. The crustaceans, insects and myriapods. Segmented worms like earthworms, or the annelids. Annelids and mollusks have a common ancestor with each other, and they have a common ancestor with the arthropods. Over here, we see, no, stay right here. Stay. I don't want you going outside and barking at the neighbors. So here we have a common ancestor between the vertebrates and echinoderm starfish. In terms of development and structures and all that, we're actually pretty closely related to starfish in the grand scheme of things. We are more closely related to starfish than to arthropods or octopus or anything like that. Then we have the vertebrates, which include chondrichthyes, which are the cartilaginous fishes like the sharks and rays. Osteichthyes, which are the bony fish. Let's see. There's also another one called lampreys, or sorry, the jawless fish, which are lampreys and hagfish. Then we have the tetrapods, which breaks off into the amphibians and another common ancestor, which are the amniotes. And that leads to, over here we have turtles, snakes and lizards, and look here, crocodiles and birds. And then over here, mammals. So every time there's a split, that means there's a common ancestor that leads to the following groups. Good boy, Ripley. All right, so some additional resources I definitely recommend as part of this lesson, maybe going and checking them out a little bit. We do have one by me in my Science in Pajamas series. So it looks at Darwin and evolution. A lot of what we talked about here is in the video, but I use my board to kind of help make it a little more visual. Yeah, go away. Yeah. And then other videos, we have the Amoeba Sisters natural selection video. Again, I love the Amoeba Sisters. They're very good at breaking stuff down and making it interesting. So definitely check that out. One by Clearly Stated, which is called What is Evolution? It's another good one. Kind of, again, talks about Darwin and what evolution is. One by a channel called Open Mind. Again, deals with Charles Darwin, his voyage, and what evolution is. And the one that I thought was interesting is a TED Talk educational video, Myths and Misconceptions About Evolution. So I definitely suggest you checking some of those out. They're great resources to help you understand a little bit more about what's going on, what evolution is, who Charles Darwin was, and why he's important. But in the meantime, if you have questions, hit me up in our Google Classroom, or you can always reach me via email. But I hope that you found this interesting. I hope you found it informative. And if you have any questions, let me know. The link for the Prezi will be in the description. This way you can have access to those video links as well. But in the meantime, hope everything is going well. Take care, stay safe, and I will talk to you guys later. All right, bye-bye.